Imagine running a quiet tavern for 12 years, thinking you've left danger behind. Then a blue-skinned woman with fresh wounds walks in, and station security follows minutes later. You lie to protect her, not knowing she's married to the most wanted rebel leader in 3 systems. By morning, 200 warships fill your docks, and your life becomes collateral in a war you never asked for. The air in the Starlight Wayfare tasted like recycled oxygen and regret. A metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. A single dented glass sat on the counter, catching the dim light from overhead fixtures that flickered with the station's uneven power supply. This was Jake's world, 12 years of his life etched into every scarred surface, every patched-up bulkhead, every smudge on the viewport that showed the cold emptiness of space. He moved through the evening routine with the precision of a man clinging to ritual. The same polished spot on the bar received his attention, the cloth moving in slow circles over the worn surface. Each motion was a quiet rebellion against the chaos he'd left behind on 3 different worlds. The Starlight Wayfare wasn't just a business, it was a carefully constructed fortress of normalcy, a place where the regulars knew their stools and the drinks came without questions. The gravity plates hiccuped momentarily, making a patron's glass slide half an inch across the table. Nobody commented. These small instabilities were part of life on Cygnus Station, another detail in the fragile piece Jake had built, drink by drink, credit by credit. He watched the ice melt in a glass of something amber, counting the minutes until closing, until he could return to the silence of his quarters above the bar. Then the door hissed open. The sound cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade. It wasn't the normal swish of a regular entering. This was sharper, more urgent. All movement in the room stilled. A miner paused with his drink halfway to his lips. The card game at the back table froze mid-deal. She stood framed in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's harsh lighting. Blue skin seemed to absorb the tavern's dim glow rather than reflect it. A fresh bandage covered part of her cheek, the white stark against the deep azure of her skin. Her eyes swept the room in one quick professional assessment, taking in exits, patrons, potential threats. They weren't just blue. They were the color of deep space, holding shadows that felt like entire wars waiting to be remembered. She moved toward the bar without hesitation, her steps quiet but purposeful. The regulars slowly returned to their drinks, but the atmosphere had shifted. Something new had entered their contained world, something that didn't belong to the careful rhythm of the Starlight Wayfare. Jake watched her approach, the polishing cloth still in his hand, already knowing his quiet evening had just ended. Lidara moved through the space like someone who expected the floor to give way at any moment. Her shoulders held a permanent tension, the kind that comes from waiting for the other boot to drop. She scanned the room in those quick professional sweeps that military types learn, assessing exits, identifying threats, calculating response times. Her gaze didn't linger on anyone, yet somehow took in everything. Jake noticed the bandage first. It wasn't some clean medical dressing applied in a proper clinic. This was field work, a quick patch job with combat efficiency. The edges weren't perfectly aligned, and a faint reddish-purple stain had already begun seeping through the center. Someone had slapped it on in a hurry, probably while moving, probably under fire. He could almost smell the adrenaline that must have accompanied its application. Then he saw the insignia. Just a flash of embroidery on the cuff of her sleeve as she reached to adjust her collar. A nebula swirling with cosmic dust, split clean through by a single lightning bolt. The design was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew the sector's politics. It wasn't government. It wasn't corporate. It was something else entirely. The entire bar had gone still. The miner at the corner table held his glass suspended halfway to his mouth, the ice cubes no longer clinking. The card players had frozen mid-deal, their hands hovering over the table. Even the usual hum of the climate control system seemed to fade into a tense silence. Every patron recognized that symbol, or at least recognized the kind of person who wore something like that into a place like this. She reached the bar without looking at anyone directly. Her movements were economical, nothing wasted. She didn't slump onto a stool but stood at the counter, her posture straight but not rigid. "Ready? What'll it be?" Jake asked, his voice sounding louder than he intended in the quiet room. Something clear, cold. Her voice held a roughness, like she'd been breathing recycled air for too long. He poured a measure of the local grain alcohol over ice, watching the cubes crack under the sudden temperature change. She didn't reach for the glass immediately. just watched the condensation form on the outside. The silence stretched. Nobody resumed their conversations. Nobody moved. They were all waiting for what they didn't know. But they recognized the atmosphere of impending trouble when they felt it. Jake studied her hands. No visible weapons, but the way her fingers rested lightly on the counter suggested she could produce one faster than most people could blink. Her nails were short, practical. A faint scar ran across the back of her right hand, pale against the blue skin. She finally took the glass, her movements precise. She didn't drink immediately, just held the cold surface against her palm for a moment before bringing it to her lips. Her eyes never stopped moving, never stopped assessing. The door hissed open again. This time the sound was different, heavier, more official. The room went from still to frozen. Lidara's hand tightened around her glass. Her eyes met Jake's for the first time, and in that moment he saw something he hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of weary resignation. He made his decision in that instant. Not because of who she was, but because of who he refused to be, the kind of man who turns away someone in trouble. The kind of man he'd left behind on 3 different worlds. The drained officer filled the doorway, his scaled bulk nearly blocking the exit entirely. His armored shoulder scraped against the metal frame as he entered, the sound like stone grinding against stone. 3 more security officers fanned out behind him, their movements precise and practiced. Their armored boots made heavy thuds on the worn floor plating, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Jake's hand went under the bar without conscious thought. His fingers found the familiar shape of the disruptor he kept taped beneath the counter, a relic from a life he thought he'd left behind 12 years ago. The metal felt cold and familiar against his palm. He hadn't touched it in years, but his fingers remembered the grip, the weight distribution, the way it settled into his hand like it was made for him. The lead officer's eyes swept the room. They were solid black, like polished obsidian, set deep in a face of greenish scales. His voice emerged as a low rumble. "We're looking for a female Azuran." He didn't consult a datapad, didn't check any records. "Matches a fugitive description. Blue skin, medium height, possible facial injury." The air in the bar thickened. You could feel the tension like static electricity before a storm. Patrons kept their eyes fixed on their drinks, on the table surfaces, anywhere but at the security team or the woman sitting at the bar. The card players had stopped pretending to play altogether, their hands resting flat on the table. Lidara didn't move. She kept her back to the door, her shoulders relaxed but ready. Her right hand rested near her glass, fingers loose. Only Jake could see how her left hand had dropped to her side, palm open, ready to reach for whatever weapon she had concealed. The drainid's gaze passed over her without stopping. To him, she was just another blue-skinned patron among what appeared to be several in the bar that evening. Cygnus Station attracted all types, and Azurans weren't uncommon in this sector. "Haven't seen anyone like that," Jake said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like it wanted out. The lie tasted strange on his tongue. Not bitter, but heavy, like speaking it committed him to something larger than he understood. The officer's black eyes fixed on him. "You certain? This establishment would be a logical place for someone like that to seek." "Temporary shelter." Jake forced a dry laugh. "Off-worlders get treated rough around here, especially Azurans lately." He let contempt color his tone, the universal language of station dwellers who'd seen too many officials come through making demands. "If I saw someone matching that description, I'd have reported it myself. Bad for business having trouble like that around." The drainid studied him for 3 long breaths. His nostrils flared slightly, taking in the scents of the bar. Alcohol, sweat, the ozone smell of the climate systems. His gaze swept the room one more time, lingering on the shadows where the lighting didn't quite reach. "Very well," he rumbled finally. "Alert security immediately if you see anyone matching that description. There's a substantial reward for information leading to capture." They turned as one unit, their armor scraping against the doorway again as they left. The door hissed shut behind them, leaving a silence that felt deeper than before. Jake kept his hand under the counter for another 30 seconds, counting heartbeats. The disruptor's cool metal seemed to pulse against his palm. He'd made his choice without thinking, without weighing consequences. Some decisions aren't made in the moment. They're waiting inside you, fully formed, ready to emerge when circumstance calls them forth. The words left Jake's mouth with a calm he didn't feel. Haven't seen anyone like that. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal trying to escape. Each thud echoed in his ears, a private counterpoint to the steady tone he maintained. The lie tasted like copper and ozone on his tongue. Not the sharp betrayal of breaking some station regulation, but the deeper bitterness of violating the fragile peace he'd built, drink by drink, over 12 long years. He watched the drained officer's black eyes narrow slightly. The scales around his temples tightened. Jake added more texture to the performance, letting the familiar contempt of a station dweller color his voice. Off-worlders get treated rough around here. He gestured vaguely toward the viewport, showing the cold emptiness of space. Especially Azurans lately. Bad for business having that kind of trouble around. He made a show of polishing the same spot on the bar again, the cloth moving in slow circles that belied the frantic pace of his thoughts. Lidara remained perfectly still, 3 stools down. She hadn't moved since the security team entered. Her breathing remained even, her posture relaxed but ready. Only someone watching closely would notice how her fingers had tightened around her glass, the knuckles pale against the blue skin. She held herself like a statue carved from ice and shadow, every muscle under perfect control. The bandage on her cheek seemed to stand out brighter against her skin, a white flag of vulnerability she would never actually wave. The Draenid's gaze swept the room one final time. His armored shoulders shifted slightly as he considered. The moment stretched, thin and sharp as broken glass. Jake kept his hand near the hidden disruptor, his fingers remembering the weapon's weight and balance despite years of disuse. He could feel the eyes of every patron in the room, their suspended conversations hanging in the air between them. Then the officer nodded once, a sharp movement of his scaled head. Very well. Alert security immediately if you see anyone matching that description. The words were a formal dismissal, a closing of this particular inquiry. They turned as one unit, their armored boots making heavy thuds against the floor plating as they retreated through the doorway. The hiss of the door closing sounded like a lock engaging. Jake counted 10 heartbeats before releasing the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His eyes met Lidara's across the bar. In that glance passed an understanding deeper than words. That nebula and lightning bolt insignia on her sleeve wasn't just some rebel gang symbol. It marked her as Nova Rider, the most disciplined, dangerous resistance force operating against the hegemony's iron-fisted control of 3 systems. They weren't mere fugitives. They were the only organized opposition that had managed to survive constant patrols, bounty hunters, and full-scale military engagements. Sheltering her wasn't just hiding a random criminal. It was taking sides in a war that had been burning through the sector for years, a war where the hegemony showed no mercy to those who aided their enemies. The quiet life Jake had built now balanced on the edge of a blade that could cut deeper than any station security inquiry. The silence after security left had a different quality than before. It wasn't just absence of sound. It was a heavy, waiting quiet that seemed to absorb the usual ambient noises of the station. The hum of life support systems faded into the background. The distant vibrations from docking clamps stilled. You could hear the ice melting in abandoned glasses. Jake moved to the door controls. His fingers tapped the sequence to lock the main entrance, then engaged the privacy screens. The transparent metal of the viewport shifted to opaque gray, cutting off the view of the station corridor. The interior lighting adjusted automatically, softening to a muted glow that deepened the shadows in the corners of the room. He turned finally to look at the woman he'd just risked everything for. His business, his freedom, possibly his life. Lidara hadn't moved from her stool. Her hands rested flat on the bar surface now, palms down. The bandage on her cheek stood out starkly in the changed lighting. "They'll be back," she said. Her voice remained low but held a certainty that felt like solid ground in shifting sands. "They always come back. First sweep is protocol. Second sweep is when they start looking properly." She didn't thank him. The absence of gratitude hung between them, more meaningful than any words of appreciation could have been. Some debts become too large for simple thank yous. They become facts of existence like gravity or oxygen requirements. The weight of what he'd done settled around them both, a shared burden that needed no acknowledgement to be real. Jake reached beneath the counter again, but this time his fingers bypassed the hidden disruptor. They found a bottle kept far back in the storage area, sealed with an actual cork rather than a pressure cap. The glass was thick, the liquid inside a deep amber that caught the light differently than the regular stock. He set 2 clean glasses on the counter, the sound of glass on polished metal unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He poured 2 fingers into each glass. The liquid moved slowly with a viscosity that spoke of careful distillation and aging. This wasn't something he served to customers. This was the good stuff saved for emergencies, or for moments when the line between disaster and survival became too thin to see. Lidara accepted the glass without comment. Her fingers brushed against his as she took it, and he felt the coolness of her skin even through the contact. She studied the contents for a moment, swirling the liquid gently before bringing it to her lips. Her eyes closed briefly as she drank, and for the first time he saw the exhaustion beneath the controlled exterior. The mystery of her presence deepened with every passing moment. This wasn't some common fugitive running from station security over stolen credits or minor violations. The way she carried herself, the certainty in her voice, the efficiency of her movements all spoke of training and purpose. That nebula and lightning bolt insignia marked her as Nova Rider, but her significance within that organization clearly went beyond ordinary membership. Station security didn't send drained officers in full armor for common criminals. They didn't conduct sweeps of established businesses without solid intelligence. She was a key player in something much larger than a simple fugitive situation. The rebellion against the hegemony had been grinding through 3 systems for years, a conflict that Aduoshu station dwellers tried to ignore, unless it directly affected their trade routes or raised security taxes. But harboring someone like Lidara meant stepping directly into that conflict, becoming part of the machinery of a resistance that had reshaped entire sectors, through both guerrilla strikes and coordinated fleet actions. The quiet Azuran woman sipping expensive liquor in his bar held more power in her wounded frame than most station administrators wielded in their entire careers. He led her to the back room without discussion. The reinforced door slid open with a heavier sound than the main entrance, its metal twice as thick. Inside, the space felt different, cooler with the distinct hum of independent life support systems. A single bunk was bolted to the wall, its surface bare except for a folded thermal blanket. Emergency lighting strips ran along the baseboards, casting a soft blue glow. This room had been his private retreat during station-wide lockdowns, his sanctuary during the occasional pirate scare that still haunted the outer sectors. They didn't speak much. Some silences become conversations of their own. He showed her the emergency controls, the hidden storage compartment, the manual override for the door. She nodded at each feature, her eyes taking in details he hadn't thought to mention. When he turned to leave, she simply said, "They'll scan for life signs." Not a question. A statement of fact. He sealed the door behind him. The heavy thud of locking mechanisms engaging sounded final. Back in the main bar, he reset the privacy screens to maximum. The usual ambient noise of the station seemed distant now, filtered through layers of security he'd rarely used. He poured himself another drink but didn't drink it. Just held the glass, watching the liquid catch the light. The docking alarms continued their relentless chorus, a mechanical wail that filled the observation deck with urgency. Lidara's voice cut through the noise, quiet but clear. "They're here for me." The words landed in the space between them, simple and undeniable. Jake turned from the viewport, his mind struggling to process what his eyes had already recorded. The truth unfolded slowly, like watching an explosion in vacuum, silent, devastating, and inevitable. She didn't look at him when she spoke again, her gaze fixed on the armada beyond the reinforced glass. "My husband doesn't believe in half measures." The word husband hit Jake with physical force, a sudden weight in his chest that made breathing difficult. His mind raced through the implications, reassembling everything he thought he knew about this woman. The careful movements, the professional assessment of threats, the way she carried herself with authority even while wounded. These weren't just traits of a Nova Rider operative. They were the qualities of someone accustomed to command, someone connected to power at the highest levels. The scale of the fleet outside suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't a standard extraction mission or a show of force. This was personal. The coordination of 200 ships, the precise timing, the blatant disregard for station protocols, all spoke of someone operating beyond military objectives. someone motivated by something deeper than tactical advantage. Jake watched another wave of vessels lock into docking position, their maneuvers perfectly synchronized despite the complexity of the operation. Lidara finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The blue of her skin seemed deeper in the emergency lighting, the bandage on her cheek standing out like a badge of honor. "When security took me from our compound," she said, her voice gaining strength, "they thought they'd captured just another high-value target. They didn't realize whose wife they'd taken." The revelation shifted the entire situation into a different perspective. This wasn't about harboring a fugitive anymore. This was about sheltering the most protected person in 3 systems. The devastating secret lay in that single word: husband. Lidara wasn't merely a member of the Nova Riders. She wasn't just some important operative or intelligence asset. Her connection to the fleet's commander was the most personal bond possible in any species. She was married to Krell Voss himself, the legendary leader whose name made system governors increase their security details, whose tactics were studied in military academies, whose very existence challenged the hegemony's claim to control 3 systems. The blue-skinned woman he'd protected wasn't just a rider, she was the heart of the rebellion itself. And the armada outside wasn't here for a mission. It was here for its queen, Krell Voss. The name alone made station governors increase security details across 3 systems. Jake had heard the stories like everyone else. Whispers in docking bays, warnings from freight captains, bulletins on secured channels. Leader of the Nova Riders, most wanted man in known space. To the hegemony, he was a monster who needed exterminating. To the oppressed systems under their control, he was the only myth still worth believing in. The kind of figure parents used to scare children into obedience, or rebels invoked to fuel their courage. And this woman, this wounded, wary woman with the fresh bandage on her cheek, was his wife. The realization landed in Jake's mind like a structural collapse. His tavern, which had felt like a fortress for 12 years, suddenly seemed fragile as glass. The reinforced doors, the privacy screens, the hidden disruptor under the bar, all meaningless against the scale of what he'd inadvertently joined. He wasn't just sheltering a fugitive. He was housing the most protected person in the rebellion, the one individual whose safety would justify any response, any cost. Jake's hand went to the polished surface of the bar, fingers tracing a familiar groove in the metal. 12 years of building something stable, something separate from the conflicts burning through the sector. All of it now measured against 2 words: Krell Voss. The man didn't just command ships, he moved fleets. He didn't just evade capture, he rewrote the rules of engagement. Station security patrols were one thing. The full attention of the most successful resistance leader in generations was something else entirely. The scale of his mistake, or his choice, became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't about a single lie to security officers anymore. This was about taking a side in a conflict that had consumed worlds, that had entire sectors living under martial law, that saw entire populations displaced for resisting hegemony control. His actions in the quiet of his bar had repercussions that stretched across star systems, that involved battle groups and supply lines and guerrilla campaigns fought on a dozen different fronts. Learning she was married to Krell Voss reshaped everything Jake thought he knew about risk, about consequence, about the true cost of kindness in a universe that punished vulnerability. Some choices aren't personal, they're planetary in scale. Helping one stranger in a bar could mean destabilizing a corporate empire's hold on 3 systems. Offering shelter could mean becoming a strategic asset in a war that had been burning for decades. The quiet life he'd built wasn't just over. It had been absorbed into something larger, something with its own gravity, its own inescapable momentum. Outside, the fleet continued its docking procedures, each new ship locking into place with the finality of a verdict being delivered. The station administrator's voice came over the comm again, advising all non-essential personnel to remain in their quarters. Standard procedure when dealing with potential hostiles. Useless when dealing with an organization that operated outside all procedures, that answered to no authority but its own. Jake watched Lidara's face, saw the calm certainty there, and understood that from this moment forward, his life would be measured against the only currency that mattered in this new reality: loyalty to a cause he never chose, and protection from enemies he never made. The first Nova Riders entered his bar without knocking. They didn't need to. The door slid open under their command codes, bypassing all the security protocols Jake had set the night before. They moved with disciplined precision, their armored boots making soft thuds on the worn floor plating. 6 of them fanned out through the room, their helmets scanning for threats, their weapons held at ready positions. They ignored the terrified patrons who sat frozen at their tables, drinks forgotten in their hands. This wasn't a social call. Their commander filled the doorway. A hulking figure with scarred facial plates that looked like burnished iron. His armor showed the dents and scratches of actual combat rather than training exercises. He moved through the room with an economy of motion that spoke of countless engagements, his eyes missing nothing. He approached Jake directly, his gaze fixed on the man behind the bar as if the other patrons were furniture. The Nova Riders repay their debts. The words came out measured and heavy, each syllable carrying weight. His voice had a gravel quality, like stones grinding together deep underground. He didn't offer a hand in greeting, didn't smile, just stated the fact as if reading from some internal codex of obligations. Jake understood immediately. His act of shelter wasn't kindness anymore, wasn't some spontaneous human decency. It had become a transaction with the universe's most dangerous banking system, one where the interest rates were paid in loyalty and protection, where defaulting meant consequences far beyond financial ruin. He'd made a deposit in their favor, and now they'd come to settle accounts. The commander's eyes swept the room again, taking in the details of the establishment. The worn bar surface, the mismatched stools, the viewport that now showed nothing but the armored hulls of their ships. "You have earned our gratitude and our shield." The words weren't a suggestion or an offer. They were a statement of fact, a recalibration of reality that Jake would have to accept. What kind of organization can deploy 200 ships for a single rescue mission? Not any government body bound by committees and budgets. Not any corporation answerable to shareholders and profit margins. This was something else entirely. An entity that operated outside conventional power structures with its own codes, its own laws, and its own definition of repayment. They didn't ask for permission or follow standard protocols. They moved according to their own internal logic, a calculus of honor and obligation that valued loyalty above all else. Their justice system wasn't about courts or legislation. It was about action and consequence, about the immediate settlement of accounts. The hegemony controlled the official channels, the trade routes, the public communications, but the Nova Riders controlled something more fundamental, the unwritten rules that governed survival in the margins, the codes that mattered when all other systems failed. They protected their own with a ferocity that no government could match, because their loyalty wasn't to some abstract concept of order. It was to each other, to those who proved themselves worthy of trust. The commander didn't wait for Jake's response. He didn't need to. The transaction was already complete, shelter given, protection offered. The terms were non-negotiable, the contract binding. Jake looked from the commander's scarred face to the armed riders positioned around his bar, to the viewport showing their fleet, and understood that his life now belonged to a different set of rules. The quiet existence he'd built was over, replaced by something with sharper edges and clearer obligations. Some banks deal in credits. This one dealt in lives. Krell Voss didn't look like a legend. He looked tired, competent, and utterly dangerous. The indigo skin, the scarification across his facial plates, the way he moved through the space, all spoke of someone who'd been fighting for so long that combat had become his natural state. He entered the Starlight Wayfarer like he owned it, which in that moment, with 200 of his ships clamped to the station's docking rings, he effectively did. The air shifted, charged with a new kind of gravity. Patrons who'd been frozen in place now seemed to shrink back instinctively, making space without conscious thought. His eyes found Lidara first. A flicker of relief passed between them, too fast for anyone but Jake to notice. A subtle tightening around the eyes, a slight relaxation in her shoulders. It lasted less than a second, then was gone, replaced by the same controlled intensity she'd carried since she first walked through his door. That moment told Jake everything he needed to know about their relationship. This wasn't some political alliance or strategic marriage. This was two people who knew each other's rhythms, who communicated in glances and micro-expressions, who carried the weight of shared history in the space between them. Then those same eyes settled on Jake. Dark, assessing, weighing him with a speed that felt invasive. He felt himself being measured against some internal standard, judged for qualities he didn't know he possessed. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the ship's systems and the occasional creak of the station's infrastructure under the strain of so many docked vessels. Jake held the gaze, refusing to look away, though every instinct told him to lower his eyes in deference. "Welcome to your new home, Jake Reeves." The words emerged with a gravelly resonance, each one carefully measured. They sounded like both promise and sentence, an invitation and a verdict delivered in the same breath. There was no question in the statement, no room for negotiation. The life he'd built, the identity he'd carved out over 12 years, was being officially retired. What came next would be defined by different rules, different loyalties, different dangers. The Nova Riders declared Jake had earned a debt not because they kept ledgers or maintained credit accounts. Their calculus operated on a simpler, more brutal mathematics. Protection created obligation. Obligation created alliance. Whether you wanted it or not didn't factor into the equation. By sheltering Lidara, Jake had inserted himself into their ecosystem of loyalty and retribution. He'd accepted an unspoken contract whose terms were now being enforced by the presence of an armada and the focused attention of its commander. There were no opt-out clauses in their system, no grace periods for reconsideration. The choice had been made the moment he looked at a wounded stranger and decided not to turn her away. Now the bill had come due, payable in the only currency they recognized, commitment. "We'll find you a suitable replacement for what the hegemony took from you," Krell said. The words carried the shape of generosity, but the tone beneath them offered no room for negotiation. It wasn't a suggestion or a friendly offer. It was a statement of fact delivered with the finality of a verdict. Jake stood there, the weight of those words settling over him like a physical pressure. He looked around the bar, his eyes tracing the familiar details he'd built over 12 years. The worn surface of the counter where countless glasses had left their rings, the specific squeak in the third stool from the left, the small crack in the viewport that had survived 3 station retrofits. These weren't just physical features. They were the architecture of his identity, the careful reconstruction of a life after losing everything else. Lidara watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable but intense. Her blue skin seemed to absorb the emergency lighting rather than reflect it. She didn't speak, didn't offer reassurance or explanation. Her silence felt more powerful than any words could have been. Jake understood that this moment wasn't about what he wanted anymore. The offer of replacement wasn't about compensating his loss. It was about erasing his old life and installing a new one, according to their design. They weren't offering him a choice. They were offering him a different cage. The tavern had been his fortress, his carefully constructed normalcy against a universe that had already taken too much. Now they wanted to replace it like a broken tool, as if 12 years of his life could be swapped out for a newer model. The psychological impact hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about losing a business. It was about having his entire identity declared obsolete, his life's work reduced to something that could be compensated and replaced. The bar had been his anchor in the chaos of the outer systems, the one thing he'd built that couldn't be taken away. Until now, Krell's earlier words echoed in the space between them. "Welcome to your new home, Jake Reeves." The meaning became terrifyingly clear. The tavern wasn't his home, it had never been his home. It was just a waiting room, a temporary shelter while his real life gathered itself outside the viewport in the form of 200 warships. The phrase signaled a complete transformation, an irreversible shift from the life he'd chosen to the life that had chosen him. His previous existence was now irrelevant, his future inextricably linked to the Nova Riders whether he desired it or not. This marked the beginning of a journey he never anticipated, a transition forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. The destruction of his bar and the bounty on his head eliminated any possibility of return. He stood at the edge of a new reality, facing the undeniable truth that some choices aren't really choices at all. They're the universe closing doors until only one path remains. The quiet life was over. What came next would be louder, sharper, and completely outside his control. The hegemony responded faster than anyone anticipated. Their ships appeared on long-range scanners, not 200 vessels like the Nova Riders' show of force, but a leaner, more brutal strike force designed for maximum damage. Their approach vectors showed no hesitation, no attempt at communication, Just the cold mathematics of strategic bombardment, calculated to reduce a space station to navigational hazards and memories. The first explosion took out the sector power grid. Station lighting flickered and died, replaced by the dull red glow of emergency systems. Life support alarms began their low pulsing wail. Patrons in the Starlight Wayfare looked up from their drinks, confusion shifting to genuine fear. This wasn't a drill anymore. The reality of conflict arrived not with warning but with impact. The second hit came 37 seconds later. A direct strike on the section directly above Jake's tavern. The ceiling groaned, then shattered. Metal beams twisted like paper clips under immense pressure. The viewport that had shown the Nova Riders' fleet now showed only fire and debris. Jake watched through the fractured glass as his life, 12 years of careful construction, of polished surfaces and familiar routines, vanished in an expanding cloud of superheated gas and structural fragments. 12 years. 4,380 days of waking to the same rituals, of pouring drinks for the same faces, of polishing the same spot on the bar until it shone like a promise. Gone in less than a minute. The air now tasted of ozone and melted polymers instead of grain alcohol and regret. His fortress of normalcy had become a tomb for the life he'd built. All because he'd offered shelter to one wounded stranger. The tavern became a target not by accident but by design. The hegemony's intelligence networks had clearly identified where Lidara had taken refuge. Their retaliation followed a classic psychological warfare pattern. Destroy the civilian infrastructure supporting your enemy. Demonstrate the cost of defiance. Eliminate any sense of safe harbor. Jake's establishment represented more than just physical shelter. It symbolized a space where someone had dared to challenge their authority, where the rules of oppression had been briefly suspended. By sheltering the wife of their most wanted enemy, Jake had moved from neutral bystander to active participant in their calculus. There are no innocent parties in total war, only combatants and obstacles. The Starlight Wayfare had become an obstacle, and obstacles get removed with extreme prejudice. The speed and precision of the attack revealed how closely they'd been monitoring the situation, how quickly they could mobilize when motivated by the combination of strategic interest and personal insult. Jake stood amid the wreckage, the sounds of secondary explosions echoing through the compromised station. The familiar weight of the disruptor felt alien on his hip now. His hand went to it automatically, fingers finding the grip that had once felt so natural. The decision to help a stranger had cost him everything he'd built since leaving that life behind. Now he faced the same choice again, but with clearer eyes and fewer illusions. Some prices get paid in installments, and the first payment had just been extracted in fire and loss. Jake stood in the rubble that had been his bar. The air carried the bitter scent of ozone and melted plastics, with an undertone of regret that seemed to cling to every surface. Twisted metal beams jutted from what remained of the ceiling, their edges still glowing with residual heat. Shattered glass crunched under his boots with each slight movement. The viewport that had once shown the peaceful emptiness of space now framed only the burning wreckage of the station's upper decks. 12 years of his life reduced to smoking debris and scattered memories. Lidara found him there, moving through the devastation with the same careful precision she'd shown when first entering his establishment. Her hand came to rest on his shoulder, the contact feeling both alien and profoundly human. Her fingers were cool against his jacket, the pressure gentle but firm. She didn't offer empty condolences or false reassurance. Her presence alone acknowledged the magnitude of what had been lost. Some choices cost more than others, she said softly. The words weren't an apology. They were an acknowledgement of the brutal mathematics of conflict, where every decision carries weight and consequences extend far beyond the moment. Her blue skin seemed to absorb the flickering emergency lights, making her appear like a statue carved from shadow and regret. The bandage on her cheek stood out starkly, a reminder that wounds came in many forms. Jake looked from the ashes at his feet to the fleet visible through the breached viewport. The Nova Riders' ships hung in space, their armored hulls reflecting the fires burning across the station. The scale of the response, the immediacy of the retaliation, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. His refusal was over. The call he'd been resisting had been answered not with words, but with fire and loss. The universe had eliminated his options until only one path remained. What choice does a man face when 12 years of his life literally goes up in flames? The same choice, but now with clearer eyes and fewer illusions. He could help strangers despite the cost, or become someone who watches worlds burn from the sidelines. The destruction of his bar wasn't just an attack on his property, it was a statement about the price of defiance. The hegemony didn't just want to eliminate threats. They wanted to eliminate the very idea of sanctuary, to teach everyone the cost of offering help to their enemies. The emotional impact settled over him not as a wave of grief, but as a cold, clear understanding. The numbness gave way to a sharp focus he hadn't felt in years. His initial disbelief transformed into acceptance of the new reality. The loss of his establishment, while devastating, also represented a liberation from the comfortable prison he'd built for himself. His tavern had been a place to hide from the universe's problems. Now those problems had literally blown the doors off his hiding place. Lidara's hand remained on his shoulder, a point of contact in the chaos. Her presence offered more than comfort, it offered purpose. The shared experience of survival created a bond that words couldn't capture. They stood together in the wreckage, two people who had now lost everything to the same conflict. The difference was that she had chosen this path deliberately, while he had stumbled into it. Now their fates were intertwined by fire and consequence. The destruction served as the final, undeniable push toward acceptance. There would be no rebuilding, no return to the quiet life. The universe had made that abundantly clear. His transformation from tavern owner to active participant in the rebellion was now complete, forced by circumstances beyond his control, but accepted with eyes wide open to what that meant. Some journeys begin with a single step. His began with everything he owned burning around him while an armada waited to welcome him to his new reality. Jake stepped through the airlock with nothing but the clothes on his back and a disruptor he hadn't fired in 12 years. The weight of the weapon felt foreign against his hip, a relic from a life he'd tried to bury beneath layers of routine and poured drinks. The transition from his ruined tavern to the Nova Riders flagship happened in the space of a single breath. One moment standing in smoke and rubble, the next boarding a vessel that hummed with purpose and discipline. The ship's interior felt nothing like his bar. Clean lines replaced worn surfaces. The air carried the sterile scent of recycled atmosphere and ozone, rather than alcohol and regret. Every surface showed maintenance, every display glowed with tactical readiness. Crew members moved through the corridors with efficient purpose, their footsteps making soft, synchronized sounds against the deck plating. This wasn't a place of temporary refuge, it was a machine built for war, and he'd become one of its newest components. They watched him as he passed. Some crew members glanced with open curiosity, their eyes tracking his movement through the ship. Others offered hostile stares, their expressions making clear an outsider's presence required justification. A few assessed him with professional detachment, their gazes measuring his potential value or threat level. Each look carried weight, each silent judgment adding to the pressure of his new reality. He felt like a specimen under examination, his every movement catalogued and analyzed. Lidara walked beside him, her presence both shield and sentence. Her proximity offered some protection from the outright hostility, her status within the riders creating a buffer of respect. But it also marked him as her responsibility, her project, her sudden attachment to this universe. Her blue skin seemed to absorb the ship's lighting, making her stand out against the muted colors of the interior. She didn't speak, didn't offer reassurance. Her silence felt more powerful than any welcome speech could have been. He'd refused this call for 12 years, built walls against it, created routines to keep it at bay, told himself the conflicts burning through the sector weren't his problem. Now reality had removed refusal as an option. The destruction of his bar, the bounty on his head, the armada outside, all served as final undeniable answers to his hesitation. The universe had closed every other door until only this corridor remained, stretching forward into a future he hadn't chosen but would have to inhabit. Sometimes the hero's journey begins not with acceptance, but with the systematic elimination of all other paths. There was no going back to being just a tavern owner, no returning to the quiet life of poured drinks and polished surfaces. That existence had been burned away, leaving only the disruptor on his hip and the woman walking beside him. The ship's hum seemed to vibrate through his bones, a constant reminder that his old rhythms had been replaced by new ones. He kept walking, following Lidara through corridors that felt both alien and inevitable, each step carrying him further from the man he'd been and closer to someone he'd never imagined becoming. The guest quarters felt smaller than his back room, but held infinitely more danger. Every surface contained technology he didn't understand. Panels with flashing glyphs, conduits humming with unknown energies, climate controls that responded to gestures he hadn't learned. The air carried a different scent here, like ozone and polished metal instead of spilled alcohol and regret. His few possessions looked absurd in this space. A worn jacket hung beside armored vac suits, his personal disruptor sitting awkwardly next to weapons racks containing rifles that looked like they could pierce bulkheads. Lidara showed him how to operate the environmental controls, her fingers moving with practiced ease across the unfamiliar interfaces. She demonstrated the pressure settings, the oxygen mix adjustments, the emergency protocols. Her movements were efficient, economical, each gesture revealing her familiarity with shipboard systems. "This dial regulates cabin pressure," she said, pointing to a circular control marked with alien numerals. "Turn it left if you feel your ears popping, right if the air starts tasting thin." Our marriage united two factions of the riders. The words came casually, as if discussing weather patterns rather than political revolutions. She didn't look at him when she said it, her attention apparently fixed on showing him the emergency oxygen mask storage. The northern clans followed him. The southern reaches followed my family. The statement hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Jake watched her hands as they moved across the control panels. The blue skin seemed to absorb the soft lighting of the cabin. He noticed how her fingers hesitated for just a moment when she mentioned the marriage, how her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just personal history she was sharing, it was political reality. The union that had brought them together wasn't about romance. It was about consolidation of power, about ending internal conflicts, about presenting a united front against the hegemony. The northern clans control the mining operations in the belt. As she continued, her voice still calm, still focused on the environmental controls. "My family commands loyalty across the southern trade routes. Together we became something the hegemony couldn't ignore." She finally turned to look at him, her dark eyes holding his. "Krell and I respect each other, care for each other even, but there was never a soul bond." The term landed between them with weight, soul bond. Jake had heard the concept before, an Azuran belief in connections that transcended arrangement or convenience. Something deeper than political alliance, more fundamental than strategic marriage. Lidara's casual admission explained the careful distance between her and Krell, the way they communicated with professional efficiency rather than personal warmth. Her marriage had been necessary for the rebellion's survival. Their union had stopped the infighting between northern and southern factions, had created the unified force that now challenged hegemony control across three systems. The personal had become political because their relationship wasn't just about two people. It was about thousands of lives, entire fleets, the future of countless worlds. Every gesture between them carried weight. Every decision echoed through the command structure. Lidara finished showing him the controls and stepped back. The lesson had ended, but the implications continued to unfold. Jake looked around the quarters again, seeing the technology with new understanding. Every system, every protocol, every alliance on this ship existed because of calculations that went far beyond personal desire. His presence here wasn't just about repaying a debt. It was about becoming part of an equation where personal relationships held strategic value and political consequences. The environmental controls suddenly seemed like the simplest thing to master in this new reality. Krell's cough began as a quiet disruption, a dry, rattling interruption during tactical briefings. At first it seemed like fatigue, the kind of weariness that clings to commanders who haven't slept through a full cycle in weeks. Then the tremors started, subtle vibrations in his hands that made styluses slip on strategy maps, minute hitches in his breathing that only someone watching closely would notice. One evening, Krell called Jake into his private quarters. The room felt different, stripped of command presence, just functional furniture and the hum of life support. Krell didn't stand to greet him, just gestured to a chair. His movements had lost their usual precision. "Vespid toxin," he said, the words blunt and unadorned. Slow acting, but quite thorough. He didn't look at Jake when he spoke, his gaze fixed on the star chart glowing on the wall. "I have perhaps 2 standard days." The revelation landed not with drama, but with grim finality. This wasn't an external attack or a tactical setback. This was an internal collapse, a rebellion eating its own heart. The toxin worked invisibly, dismantling neural functions while leaving the body standing. No cure existed, no treatment beyond pain management. Krell had known for weeks, had felt the degeneration accelerating, had chosen to conceal it until the last possible moment. Then he named Jake as his successor. The decision made no sense on the surface. A human bartender with no faction loyalty, no military rank within the Riders, no history with their cause. But Krell saw what others missed. Jake's actions the night Ladara arrived revealed a character tested under pressure. His background as a former Alliance captain, uncovered through discreet record checks, showed tactical experience they desperately needed. Most importantly, Jake belonged to no faction. He wasn't Northern Clan or Southern Reach. He wasn't bound by old rivalries or entrenched loyalties. Krell understood the rebellion's fragility. His marriage had united two powerful factions, but his death threatened to shatter that unity. Choosing a successor from either side would reignite the very conflicts their union had resolved. The Northern clans would never accept a Southern leader. The Southern Reaches would reject Northern command. An outsider became the only viable option, someone who could stand between the factions without favoring either. Jake's connection to Ladara provided crucial leverage. Her Southern lineage gave him legitimacy with one faction, while his neutrality made him acceptable to the other. Krell's selection wasn't about friendship or gratitude. It was cold political calculus, a desperate move to prevent civil war within the rebellion as they faced external annihilation. The Vespid toxin left no time for debate or democratic process. The decision had to be immediate, absolute, and irreversible. Some leaders are chosen for their experience, others for their bloodline. Jake was chosen for what he wasn't, a partisan, a traditionalist, a prisoner of the past. In a movement tearing itself apart along old fault lines, the only person who could hold it together was the one who didn't belong to any of its pieces. Krell's final act wasn't sentiment, it was strategy, executed with the same precision that had made him legendary, even as his body betrayed him. Jake stood at the viewport, watching stars he no longer recognized. The patterns had shifted, the constellations rearranged into formations that meant nothing to him. The disruptor felt heavy on his hip, an old model from a life that no longer existed, its weight a constant reminder of choices that couldn't be undone. Beyond the reinforced glass, the Nova Riders' fleet hung in formation, their hulls reflecting the cold light of unknown suns. This wasn't the view from his tavern anymore. This was the view from the command deck of a warship, and the man looking out wasn't the person who'd polished that bar for 12 years. Ladara joined him silently, her blue skin absorbing the strange light from the viewport. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him watching the unfamiliar starscape. Her presence had become familiar in these quiet moments, a constant in the chaos that had become his life. The bandage was gone from her cheek now, replaced by a faint scar that only made her look more battle-hardened, more real. Azurans believe in soul bonds. Her voice was quiet but clear in the humming silence of the command deck, connections that transcend arrangement. She didn't look at him when she said it, her gaze fixed on the stars. What Krell and I had was necessary, important, but it was never that. Jake thought about his bar, the polished surface, the familiar stools, the regulars whose lives he'd known for years. He thought about the refusal he'd maintained for so long, the careful distance he'd kept from the conflicts burning through the sector. That life felt like someone else's memory now, a story he'd been told about another man in another time. The universe had systematically dismantled every option until only this path remained, every choice narrowing the possibilities until rebellion became his only direction. Helping one stranger in trouble didn't make him a wanted rebel leader overnight. It happened one decision at a time. The first lie to station security, the shared drink in the quiet bar, the reinforcement of the backroom door, the acceptance of the fleet's presence, the step through the airlock, the weight of the disruptor returning to his hip after 12 years. Each choice built upon the last, each action eliminating alternatives until only forward momentum remained. The price on his head wasn't punishment for a single act of kindness. It was the cumulative cost of every subsequent decision, every time he chose protection over safety, loyalty over survival. The hegemony didn't care about his motives, only his actions. and his actions had placed him squarely in their sights, his name moving up threat assessments with every hour he remained with the riders. Lidara's hand found his, her fingers cool against his skin. The contact felt different now, not just gratitude or alliance, but something deeper that neither of them had named. "Some paths choose us," she said softly. "We only decide how we walk them." Jake looked from their joined hands to the fleet outside, to the unfamiliar stars, to the command console waiting for his attention. The transformation was complete. The bartender was gone, replaced by a commander who understood that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't seeking change, but refusing to look away when it finds you. The universe had offered him a simple choice between watching worlds burn or helping to rebuild them, and his answer had been written in every decision that brought him to this viewport, with this woman facing this future. 3 months later, they called him Commander Reeves. The hegemony placed a bounty on his head so large it could purchase a small colony world, all because he decided to help a stranger in trouble one quiet evening in his bar. He never planned to lead a rebellion or become a wanted man. Sometimes the universe doesn't ask if you're ready. It just asks what you're made of when everything you've built is on the line. His answer transformed a simple bartender into a legend, proving that courage often arrives unannounced, wearing the face of a choice.